Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the greatest games on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. With me is Jonathan Wilson, and with us is Nick Ames, football reporter for The Guardian. Nick, good to have you on the pod.
Hi, Marcus. Thanks for having me.
Now, today we go back to October 2014 for the Euro 2016, a Group I qualifier in Belgrade between Serbia and Albania that was awarded as a 3-0 win to Albania after the match had been abandoned after 42 minutes. Nick, why have you chosen this game?
I've chosen this game because it wasn't really much of a game, but the 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes when it went completely crazy, as we'll go into later, was probably the most remarkable, weird, and plain dangerous scenario I've ever seen inside a football stadium. One of the strangest nights of my life in any context, I would say. And also a completely non-footballing moment as well, where this sort of shuddering collision of geopolitical, very localised geopolitical concerns sort of crashed into each other and created something that was not just back page news, it was front page news as well, I think.
Yeah, it was an incredible story, and I feel if people are looking for Jonathan to do a tactical rundown of those 42 minutes, they might be disappointed in this podcast. There's an awful lot of context needed for this. I'll start us off, Jonathan, by saying Group I consisted of Portugal, who won the group, of course.
Albania. They'd lost the opening game to Albania.
They had.
I guess, in its own way, helped increase the tensions because suddenly Albania was sniffing qualification, which they'd never done for a major tournament before.
Yeah, well, they're with Portugal, Albania, Denmark, Serbia, and Armenia. Armenia and Azerbaijan were kept apart in qualifying. People will be aware of that. With Henrik Mkhitaryan and Arsenal, the Europa League, and all that business. But Albania and Serbia were not kept apart. UEFA said this was because they'd not been directly involved in fighting a war with each other. They, of course, have strong disagreements with regards to Kosovo, it's fair to say. But neither association asked to be separated from the other, Jonathan. So there they were in the group. But we know that there is a lot of history between these two.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there has, throughout the 20th century, or certainly post-Second World War, there's been a lot of tensions in terms of borders, and Kosovo is the flashpoint. And without wanting to get bogged down in too much of a detail of this, I'm also acutely conscious that my understanding of this comes broadly from the Serbian side, so there may well be a slightly different telling of this, but essentially Kosovo is hugely important to the Serbian sense of nationhood. That the key battle when Serbia was occupied by the Ottoman Empire came in 1389, the Field of Blackbirds, Kosovo Polje, where the Serbs were defeated. Prince Lazar was killed, but also the Sultan Murad was killed. And this is seen as sort of the heroic last battle of Serbian defiance. And so this battle, the battlefield, becomes sort of sanctified. The 5 key monasteries of the Serb Orthodox Church, and the Serb Orthodox Church is obviously very important to Serb nationhood, are in Kosovo. So that's why Serbia feels it has an emotional, historical claim on Kosovo. And for a long time, you had ethnic Albanians and ethnic Serbs living side by side. And I remember talking to Shefki Kuci, who is a Kosovan Albanian who fled to Finland, and him saying that, when he grew up, you had ethnic Albanians, ethnic Serbs living perfectly happily next door to each other. And then as tensions ramp up through the 90s, things start to get unpleasant. Now, one of the reasons for that, Serbs would tell you, is an increase in the number of ethnic Albanians living there, partly through immigration, and partly, they say, because the Albanian birth rate is much higher. Now, I have to say I've not been able to find any evidence as to whether that's true or not. But also, Kosovo was not an economically vibrant area, so a lot of Serbs left to go to Belgrade. And so eventually you get a situation where an area where you have had a balance becomes very predominantly ethnically Albanian. And you then have that absolutely intractable problem of who has the right, who owns the land. Is it the people who live there, or is it the people with historical claim? And as with a lot of cases all over the world, those two things don't really go together. So that's why Kosovo is such a flashpoint, and Albania had not played a game in Belgrade since 1967. So this game is a huge moment for that reason. And then you also have the following week, Edi Rama, the Prime Minister of Albania, is making a state visit to Belgrade, which is also of historical significance, historical importance. And actually, I don't know if you would agree, Nick, but it seems to me both governments, both football federations really missed an opportunity to make the game about sort of a festival of newfound friendship between the two nations in the context of that official state visit.
Yeah, I was just looking actually at my preview, or one of the several previews I wrote of that game, and I was commenting that there seemed to be some appetite from both sides about making it a nice bilateral event with the visit coming up, and so there was definitely an appetite for that politically, but afterwards it ended up with having a lot of fingers pointed. I'd also point out that as well as the historical claims and that kind of thing on Kosovo. There was the war as well in the late 90s, and so many very open wounds on both sides, but particularly the Kosovan Albanian side. I think a lot of people who had lost people, a lot of people for whom it was still any kind of meeting between these two teams would be a very visceral event with a lot of open wounds. So I think, there's the historical angle, but there was also something very immediate from the past 20 years.
Well, and of course, this was sort of foreseen because Albanian fans were banned from attending the match in Serbia. So people were aware, of course. I mean, how on earth could they not be? But Nick, when you went to this match and you were sort of on your way there, I mean, I presume nobody could have predicted what would happen, but did you feel it? Did you think, oh, hang on, there might be something in the air tonight?
Well, do you know what? At the time, I was I was mainly a freelancer, really, working for The Guardian and ESPN and a few others at the time. And Jonathan knows this well. You'll sort of have a look down the international break calendar and think, where might something really go down in the next sort of break? And the moment that draw was made, it completely jumps out at you. And I looked at that and thought, okay, I bet not many people are going to end up going there. I'm going to go and check this out and see what happens. But I must admit, another thing that Jonathan will probably also agree with is that a lot of journalism is often about previewing the occasion and writing this big piece about what's about to maybe happen, and then it doesn't really happen and goes off quite smoothly. And that's what I thought was going to happen here, to be honest. I wrote about all the geopolitical concerns. I wrote about the history. I wrote about the footballing angle as well, and how it could be such a seismic affair. But I didn't really, on the day of the game, get a sense of it. I'd been the day before I'd been in Bosnia the day before. I thought I'd combine a few games, and I went to, it was Bosnia v Belgium in Zenica, wrote a piece about Belgium for somebody, and then got about 2 hours sleep back at the hostel in Bosnia with a friend of the show, Sasha Ibril, who I'm sure you guys know, because we were making this journey together. So we got about 2 hours sleep in our hostel in Sarajevo, and then we had to catch this flight, and we arrived in Belgrade at probably about 8 a.m. And I must admit, the enthusiasm at that point to go to another football match was pretty slim. And I remember walking around Belgrade that afternoon, and it was so quiet, no indication of anything. I remember saying to Sasha, we could just go for a couple of beers, and nothing's going to happen. And it was said in sort of 50% joke, but, we weren't really feeling it. But then you get there, maybe, at a game like that, you have to get into the stadium quite a long time before kick-off, because otherwise you are going to have problems. And you turn up about 3 hours before, and there was probably more armed police outside Partizan Stadium and in the sort of half mile surrounding it than I've seen anywhere in my entire life. And it was getting darker, and suddenly you can start to cut that tension with a knife, and you walk towards the stadium, and then suddenly your hair starts raising up on end. And once we got in there, it just hit another level, of course. But yeah, certainly throughout the day building up to it, I couldn't have told you that was going to happen.
Yeah, Jonathan, you mentioned earlier, obviously Albania, they got off to a flyer in the group, beating Portugal 1-0. You mentioned the sort of the footballing side of things sort of slightly. They're drawn at home with Denmark going into this match with Serbia. So, and of course Albania would go on to qualify for their first major tournament. So there was a bit of expectation as well in a footballing sense, that because Serbia, obviously we know some of their players, and they've played at sort of one or two tournaments before, but there was a little bit extra something in a footballing sense as well.
Yeah, I mean, and Serbia they'd drawn they only played one game at this point, and they'd drawn that away to Armenia, which I think even at the time was pretty obviously a poor result. I mean, Armenia ended up finishing bottom of the group, so there was pressure on Serbia. But yeah, I think Albania, there must have been a sense. I mean, they had Loiksana and Tomin Xhaka, probably the two best known players. But they Loiksana, of course, had been captain of Marseille, had his glorious season at Sunderland, and was a genuinely very, very good footballer. So I think there was a sense that yes, they had a decent side, but also if you win away to Portugal, I mean, obviously we didn't know then that Portugal were going to go on to win it, but winning away in Lisbon is a big result, and it gives you, and especially with 3 teams to qualify, or 2 teams plus a handful of best third place teams to qualify, they're in a great position. I guess they're looking at that game in Belgrade, thinking, well, if we can get a result here, suddenly our only hard game left is going to Denmark, and if you only have to finish top 3 to qualify, or to have to be in a playoff to qualify, then avoiding defeat in Belgrade almost gets them there.
And they did really fancy their chances, I remember, because they were managed at the time by a very wily old Italian guy called Gianni Di Biasi, who's sort of been around at some fairly modest clubs, I think mainly in Serie A and Serie B. And it was pretty, I wouldn't go as far as saying it was old school Catenaccio, but it was making the most of what they had, which was sort of 11 warriors like someone like Loiksana, for example. And they were very inconvenient opponents, I think, for a Serbia team that, as with most Serbia teams, you would best describe as mercurial. They had a lot of wonderful talents, and the individual flair never in doubt. But did it ever come together? Very rarely. So Albania came into that game, I think, as Jonathan alluded, feeling confident and feeling that they probably could get Serbia's number fairly quickly.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, let's have a quick break, and after that we'll talk about what went on the night itself. See you in a moment, everybody. Welcome back to the greatest games on the Blizzard. So then we get to this sort of fateful evening. Nick, you're a little bit tired, but as you say, that the sense of occasion is sort of gripping you as you go into the stadium. Now, I believe that the Albania bus was targeted by Serbia supporters, or certainly there were some suggestions of that. So certainly Albania knew they were in for quite an evening, perhaps. Did that news sort of reach you, or was it the sort of the what the fans were reportedly chanting? There's a lot of unsavoury stuff going on, is what I'm trying to get at.
I never knew about that at the time. I do remember, as I said, it was about 3 hours, I think, before kickoff, and I remember we either couldn't find or we couldn't get to the media entrance because the crowds were so thick. So we had to sort of go in through a turnstile with everybody else, and it was at that point you knew what you were getting into because it was right. It was raw, it was fever. There was a lot of chanting that, I mean, my Serbian is not very good, but I know now that it meant kill the Albanian, kill the Albanian, and I don't think we can swear, but F Kosovo, and stuff like that. And there's lots of call and response, Kosovo, Serbia, which we would then later hear inside the stadium too. So as we got pushed and crammed into the turnstile, you could kind of tell what the atmosphere would be like. There were also very, very minimal checks on anyone going in there. Like there was no sort of pat down or anything like that. So the security itself, which would later become an important theme, was very slight. And then in you go and you sit down, and then it becomes very clear as the teams are warming up that the Albanians are being whistled a lot, and stuff's being thrown down and hurled at them, and things like that. Lots of flares. but maybe nothing where you think, okay, this is going to kick off and turn violent. And then in the first if we go to the game itself, the first half hour or so, it was mainly Serbia keeping the ball and not breaking through. A couple of counter attacks I call from Albania. Mainly a backdrop of the crowd. I just remember there was the one side chanting Kosovo, one side chanting Serbia, Kosovo, Serbia, Kosovo, Serbia. To denote that they believe Kosovo to be part of Serbia, as Jonathan was earlier explaining. And I remember there was a couple of times when Albanian players got a ball in the face, and there were a couple of very crunching challenges when you just sort of felt the temperature raise a little bit. But it was getting towards half time. It was getting towards the sort of 40th minute. And at that point, you were thinking, okay, this could easily just become a kind of slightly tense, nervy, knife-edge 0-0 draw where no one quite does enough to make it particularly interesting. And the backdrop is just sort of your classic hostile environment. And then it absolutely went mad.
Yeah, the match, of course, was suspended for a moment. There was flares thrown on the pitch and all sorts of things. And poor old English referee Martin Atkinson had a lot on his plate, Jonathan.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I remember I was at a game between Greece and Croatia in Piraeus in the Olympiacos Stadium. I can't remember when this would have been, but the referee was Howard Webb, and there'd been some fights in town between fans, and then I think it was in the stadium. It was Greek fans trying to get revenge on Croats for things that happened in the city, and there was this kind of an enormous, not an enormous bucket, a normal sized bucket, but it was full of petrol was thrown, and this enormous flame shot up, like literally from ground level. The flame was up to the roof of the stand, and I was sort of 50, 60 yards away. I could feel the heat of it. And Howard Webb was magnificent. And I don't think I've ever felt prouder of an English sporting figure than I did of Howard Webb that night. And I kind of think Martin Atkinson did this really well. I mean, I obviously wasn't there, but what I've seen on the footage, he appears totally calm and totally in control of the situation. Was that what you felt, Nick?
Not at first. It was this weird dawning realisation that everyone had. I mean, in terms of controlling that first 40 minutes, I mean, yeah, a few tackles and flares and stuff, but nothing that Martin Atkinson would not have expected. But then it got to a point where another flare was thrown on the pitch, right down in front of where I was sat, actually. And it almost hit an Albanian player, I can't remember who. So Atkinson, for I think the second time that night, stopped the game. And I think he was getting ready to restart it when suddenly you could just you kind of hear a hush around the stadium and a few whistles going up, and the atmosphere just completely changed. An almost sort of menacing quiet with a few whistles, and you look up, and I looked up to my right, and you see this drone, which at the time you can't see what it's suspending, but it's a Greater Albania flag coming down, and Danko Lazovic, the Serbia player, is having to go up to Martin Atkinson, basically tap him on the shoulder and say, no, look, that's going to cause some real trouble in a moment.
Well, that's an amazing bit of footage, the shot of him sort of literally tapping on the shoulder and pointing at it.
Yeah. And like, at that point, the drone is not interfering with play, but Lazovic knows full well what is about to happen with that, and he's pointing to Atkinson, and the game doesn't really restart, as I remember, and then the drone starts coming down, and I have this flashback. All I remember is having this flashback, and it's a small digression, but about 6 months previously, I had covered Kosovo's first ever official game against Haiti in Mitrovica, which is a split ethnic Serb and an ethnic Albanian city.
But that's where Shefkikuchi's from.
Yeah, exactly. He's been close to there, and I remember about 2/3 of the way through that game, a drone flew over, suspending a big Albanian flag, because at Kosovo games you tend to get as many Albanian flags, if not more, than actual Kosovo flags. And nothing kicked off then, but I remember suddenly seeing it coming down in Belgrade and thinking, why am I seeing this again? Oh my goodness, this is what this means this time. And yeah, it came down, and suddenly the place started going berserk. And I think it was Stefan Mitrovic the Serbia defender, centre back, I think he was at Anderlecht, wasn't he, at the time, who was stood there just inside the Albania half, and it came down, and the stands are going crazy at this point. Like, no one knows what's going on, and no one seems to know how to quite react or how to uncork their fury at this.
So sorry, Nick. I mean, we now know what was on the flag, but so there's the.
So yeah, it was a map that somebody had drawn of a notional Greater Albania, which was basically all of the lands in ex-Yugoslavia, all around ex-Yugoslavia, that Albanians would consider theirs. So you've got Albania as we know it now, you've got Kosovo, and you've also got a part of North Macedonia. And it had drawn out those territories and then written the word autochthonous.
Which autochthonous is a word that I only ever see in the context of Albania. Like, it's only ever used of Kosovo and North Macedonia. It's not used of anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm aware. But it means sort of. That night. Yeah, I think that was the first time I'd ever come across it, but I've come across it subsequently. But it basically means the indigenous people of an area, right?
Mm. Exactly. So yeah, for better context, that was what this flag had on.
But and there's also the two portraits, one of
Ismail
Bolliatini and one of Chamari.
Yeah,
Albania's founding fathers. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I mean, also the question I was sort of edging towards was how obvious was it what it was at the time? Or was it clearly kind of a bit of Albanian propaganda at the time, or was it only subsequently that became apparent?
No, really obvious, just because of the colours. Like, I couldn't see the whole detail then, but the colours and the reaction it spawned around me, like even in the press box, because it was a classic sort of Serbian press box where there's about 3 media and about 2,000 wives, girlfriends, families, and relatives, and everything. So everyone apart from about 4 of us was just going absolutely, mad about it. No, it was obvious what it signified, definitely. Mm-hmm. So as it comes down, it's being caught by a Serbian player, Mitrovic. Now, I thought at the time, and I still think, that Mitrovic was going to take it, roll it up, and put it on the side, and say, I want to get on with my game of football. That's what I genuinely think. Maybe I was naive, and maybe I really am. But obviously, that for the Albanian guys, symbolically, is their flag coming down and being picked up and pocketed by a Serbian, which they're not going to have at all. So 2 of their guys, I think it was Andy Lila, and I think it was Taran Shaka, who's Granit Xhaka's brother, came up to him and they started wrestling it off him, and there was a little bit of a tussle, and in the end they come away from it. They come away with it, and the whole sequence ends up with Bekim Balai, who was the centre forward, who I think scored the winner against Portugal in the game that you spoke about earlier, going towards the side with the flag, but he's going towards like the Serbian bench and substitutes and everything. And that's where a lot of the scenes that you may have seen from this game really kick off. You have substitutes piling in. You have a fan coming on, attacking Balai with a chair. You have Loic Sana.
Well, the weird thing is, it's not even a chair, is it? It's like a little plastic stool. There's no.
It's a plastic stool.
I just can't work out who on earth would have had that with them. Like, it's the kind of thing that, I don't know, like a grandparent might take to school sports day. It's such a kind of odd weapon. Like, of all the weapons to kick the thing off, a little kind of granny stool. It's like,
I love that's your takeaway from that scene.
But there's something there's almost something comic about it. It's so sort of like this furious man with this pathetic weapon trying to hit Bella with it, and then Loic Sana piles in and absolutely nails a guy.
He piles in, and there's just like a general melee, I would say, for about a minute and a half, and then you've got, on the other side of the pitch, you've got this bald figure in shorts. Not me, by the way. It was much as I was tempted to weigh in.
The spectre at the feast, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It was a quite notorious Serbian hooligan called Ivan Bogdanov, who'd been in trouble for quite a lot in years gone by, and I think had a spell in prison. And he kind of got out from the stand, jumped on the pitch, almost as in a sense of sort of obligation, like, okay, it's going down here. I'd better see what's going on and get involved and throw my weight around. So he goes on, like, I wasn't watching him, fully, but I think he got on and had a look around and went back again. But that was quite a defining picture afterwards of this guy Bogdanov, who was a really arch famous Serbian hooligan, walking in and sort of considering getting involved. But so the stuff's still coming down onto all the Albanians, and all of this is happening in about a 2-minute window.
Yeah,
that's what's happening. But how it ends, or how this bit of it ends, is. So I was sat with Sasha right above the tunnel, which is one of those extendable, slightly wobbly, fold-out things, And so the Albanians have decided to leave the pitch. So they're walking off, and then suddenly, absolute pelters from the stands, and a few fans coming on, starting to try and kick them. There's a guy in red shorts and skins, just sort of, taking swipes at people, and they're all suddenly covering their heads and running down the tunnel in absolute fear. There's genuine fear because they're being hit by absolutely everything. And the tunnel is kind of swaying this way and that because they're all kind of bundling into each other in the tunnel, just trying to get down it. And it was that moment when the Albanians were running down the tunnel with the obvious terror in their faces where I kind of thought, here, hang on, this could absolutely go any way here. Anyone could get hurt seriously. This could end up very bad. That was as bad as it got. But it was a tremendously weird and unsettling thing to see right in front of your face.
Yeah, I know this sounds a bit sort of weird thing to say, but looking at that footage and hearing what you said there, when Stefan Mitrovic, he takes down that flag and all the rest of it, like, I am, again, I say this as an Englishman who clearly doesn't understand the situation, or certainly cannot get into the mindset of the passions that run high in this, but it was the Albanian players sort of rushing towards him and grabbing that flag and so on. I just think to myself, had they not have done that, and I'm not blaming or sort of pointing at them, because clearly, as you say, they got a lot of treatment and so on. But looking back over this, it is a surprise reaction from those players. But I say that in my naivety as someone who doesn't quite get it.
It's just so inflammatory, and what happened was so inflammatory that I think if they saw their flag coming down onto Serbian territory and they wanted it to be theirs, it was almost a sort of primal reaction. I don't think any of us can understand it. Like I can't logically understand it, but if I hear about the history and the background and the emotions, then you kind of get it a bit more. But
But I think it is worth reiterating that Mitrovic. I mean, who knows what he was going to do, but what we see him do is totally reasonable. He takes the flag down and he's taking it off the pitch. So there's absolutely no blame attached to him.
Yeah, that's what he was going to
do.
That to me is kind of like, oh, blimey, right, we've got a game of football here to play, and that's where the football, some of the footballers almost sort of forget why they're there and so on. And again, I understand that as much as I can, thus probably not understanding it, if you see what I mean.
I mean, the only thing you could say is maybe Martin Atkinson should have been the one to take the flag down. But, it wasn't next to him at the time, so... it's a strange one. I mean, there was... the responsibility for the drone was claimed by a fan group of a Macedonian side, which was operated by Albanians. There's no evidence to suggest that was true, Nick. Was that ever...
It was fascinating afterwards. I mean, I'll just quickly go into the sort of immediate half hour after. Please, sorry, after what happened, but it's directly linked to that. So there was a kind of 15 minutes where everyone, even the people who've been really misbehaving, seemed a bit dazed and confused. Like, oh my goodness, what has happened here? So it all kind of got very calm, and there were these announcements which I was having to have translated for me, of course, but saying, okay, the game is going to restart. And at that point, we didn't know if it would restart straight away or if they get all the fans out and then try and restart it. And then it became a bit more likely that the latter might happen. And then about 15 minutes, maybe half an hour after that, we finally heard that it was off, completely off. So, there's a lot to work to do. As the only UK journalist there, your phone's going crazy, emails, etc. But I just remember finally walking downstairs into the press room when the stadium was virtually empty, and none of my Serbian journalist colleagues, one or two of whom are good friends, and again, Jonathan will know some of them in particular, they couldn't look you in the eye. Like, nobody would talk to you. Nobody would kind of acknowledge, there was a real feeling of absolute embarrassment, whether or not they felt they were at fault or the Albanians were. There was a feeling of just absolute, how has this happened here? So then, of course, the rumours start going around as to who did it. And really late that night and early the next morning, the favourite rumour that people start coming up with is that Orfi Rama, who is the brother of the Albanian president Edi Rama.
Prime Minister, I think Prime Minister, not President.
Prime Minister, you're right. So, someone spreads around that he was there and was controlling it from in the VIP box or something like that, and all these massive sort of half truths start coming out the next day about how he's been stopped at the airport and they found something on him and things like that. And in the former Yugoslavia, a lot of rumours and half truths do spread very easily. But the next day, that was the main line of inquiry among people like me and other people who were trying to get to the exact bottom of it. And you're right, there was definitely a group of Macedonians were quite keen to take credit, because you tended to find in the aftermath that a few people were quite happy to say they'd done it, because it's obviously quite a big moment. But in the end, which I guess we might come to it stuck to one man called Ismail Marina, who I met the following year and who still claims to this day that it was him.
I mean, his story is plausible, though, isn't it? I mean, it's having read various interviews with him, both with you and with James Montague. He seemed credible, or do you not think so?
He's credible. I met him. So there was.
Did he do the drone at Gatwick Airport as well? I don't think they found that one.
Yeah. He's just made a career out of it.
But I mean, he said that he was in the Church of the Archangel Gabriel, which would be within the 800 metres, would have a line of sight to the stadium. So that seemed to make sense. The point he made about he got confused as to which side was which, because he expected Serbia to be in white and Albania were in white, and that's why he flew towards Mitrovic. He was trying to fly towards Albania. That seems to me to make sense. That seems like the kind of thing you might do, and the kind of mistake you might make. So from that point of view, but I mean, you've met him, so you tell me.
No. I think you're pretty spot on. But he also claimed to me the following year that he hadn't meant to bring it down towards the pitch, that he miscalculated and was trying to fly on a sort of arc over the stadium just so people could sort of point and look rather than sort of bundle in and kick off. And a few of his claims do differ a bit. I think it probably was him. What I do know is that he had definitely created a kind of cult of celebrity around himself, because I went back the following year when they played in Albania for the penultimate match day of that group. Massive game, because by then Albania had just been awarded those 3 points from the game that was abandoned. But yeah, I turned up to meet him because I'd kind of had a bit of a complicated time setting it up. But I ended up meeting him in the back room of this cafe in Tirana. He's got like a sort of entourage around him very much, and he's just this little slight guy with a beard and curly hair. You wouldn't say boo to a goose when you look at him. But he's got all these people around him, and so we start talking and have a lovely dinner and a few drinks and that kind of thing. But every kind of 5 or 10 minutes, somebody was ushered in off the street for a selfie, and then ushered out again, and there was just this sort of parade of people coming in wanting to meet Ismail Marina, and somehow knowing that he was in the back room of this quite obscure cafe. For reasons that again we can go into later, he didn't make it to the game.
We can talk about that. I mean, because he was arrested the day before the game, right, for illegal possession of a pistol. Is that right? Yeah,
he was arrested. He was getting through his fair share of media work in the preceding couple of days, and he was with someone who we all know, James Montague.
I was wondering when Monty was going to appear in this story. Because I think he was.
He popped out of the woodwork for the rematch, so there was me, James Montague, and Rory Smith all covering it from the UK. Actually,
the Holy Trinity.
I was about to say, yeah.
So me and Rory were somewhere else that night. I don't know, but James Montague had driven to Durrës, which is a port town, probably about 45 minutes to an hour outside Tirana that night, and they were doing some filming of something with Ismail Marino. I don't quite know why they'd gone there. He would
it's quite a nice. Durrës is sort of like a seaside resort. It's where King Zog's palace is. It's quite an attractive place. So I can see if you wanted to sort of do an interview with a scenic backdrop, it would be a good place to do it.
Yeah, nice for filming. So they'd done that, and then they were driving back at night, and yeah, they were stopped under quite weird circumstances, and it just so happened that the police found Ismail Marina in possession of a firearm, which just so happened to be the day before the game, and just so happened to mean that they had to put him out of view, lock him up before the game. And I just remember the next day being in Elbasan, which was the city where the game was held, being in a cafe that afternoon with James and Rory, and we're looking up at the TV, and there's this Albanian news channel, and suddenly you look up and there's a screenshot of Ismail Marina, and the screen changes, and then it's of James Montague. And it says in Albanian, New York Times journalist was with Marina when arrested, and again, James would tell the story better, but his face just went like that, and just for, and it was, and then we're sat in this cafe for the next sort of 3 or 4 hours because there's nothing else to do in Elbasan. So we're sat there, and every half an hour at least that bit is coming round again.
Oh man.
And just for a few hours, he was the most wanted man in Albania because of the association with the arrest of Ismail Marino, which kept him from going to the game. And that's a digression, but it was a very funny build-up.
And then Marina, so we should, I mean, as far as I'm aware, because Marina was then released not long afterwards, he was then arrested again in Croatia in 2017 on an Interpol warrant from Serbia. And because his wife is Italian, that apparently gave him, because he had Italian residency through that, he had the right to be jailed in Italy. And he was released in 2018 for reasons I don't fully understand, and it's never gone to trial, as far as I'm aware. Is that right? Is it?
That's the latest that I understand it, but I'm not quite sure where that is now. But definitely, I think I think he did do it. I think he liked the publicity afterwards. There's a few bits of his accounts that aren't quite consistent, but nobody else has come forward and said they did it. But it was definitely very expedient of the police to get him out of the way for match day.
Indeed. Well, we won't ask about the whereabouts of James Montague right now, but we will say that because you said, or it was said that obviously the game was given as a 3-0 walkover to Albania. But I mean, if there's complications,
but it wasn't initially. Initially, it was given as a 3-0 walkover to Serbia.
So I was going to say, if in terms of you think it's complicated and convoluted in terms of the surrounding and the history and all the rest of it, well, trying to figure out how to give this match a result was rather difficult as well. So 10 days later, after the match, UEFA awarded Serbia a 3-0 walkover against Albania on the grounds that Albania had been at fault for refusing to resume the match. Nick, I mean that was obviously rather contentious for the Albania Football Association.
Which was very contentious because I think anyone present could have told you that they weren't safe, and they were coming into the dressing room with wounds, and a few of them showing on Twitter that blood had been drawn and stuff like that, just from things which had been thrown to them. So I don't think anyone whatsoever could blame them for running inside in the first place, and then for not wanting to continue because you couldn't carry on playing there. So that was bizarre, and there was a lot of the argument was then came down to the provocation having come from the Albanian side or somebody presumably connected with Albania, who we now believe is Ismail Marina. But then the argument against was the absolutely shoddy security and crowd control in Serbia, and also I think the rap sheet that Serbia had already built up with UEFA. There'd been fairly recently an anti-Semitic banner, I think, in the same stadium against Tottenham fans when they played in the Europa League, I think it was. Not that long before, I think there'd been the racist incident with England under-21s in Kosovo, which I think got them in trouble. So there'd been a mounting rap sheet for Serbia, as you know, in the previous years, and I think ultimately it had to end in them taking the bigger hit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point here, I mean, and I agree with UEFA on this. I think they're very reluctant to punish a federation for the crimes of the fans, and I think that is right. Quite apart from anything else, because there's a danger. I mean, there's a sense of kind of fairness and justice, and the danger of false flag attacks, but also it sets up a series of false incentives. So you saw, for instance, when there was the racist incident of when. Well, not just incident, but kind of sustained racist chanting when England played in Bulgaria. And the Bulgarian FA's immediate reaction was to go, nothing happened, don't know what you're talking about. And if they're fearing punishment, of course that's how you react, because you want to minimise whatever punishment there is or escape it altogether. Whereas if you're UEFA or any sort of body kind of trying to make things better, what you want is a federation to go, yeah, they did this. I don't. Help us deal with it. What should we do? Give us some money to kind of put in place campaigns, measures to stop this, cameras so we can isolate the people involved, whatever. And so I think that's why those two reasons, the basic unfairness and just creating false incentives to cover things up, is why sort of collective punishments or punishing a federation for the crimes of their fans are a bad idea. However, I also think the home federation has to take responsibility for security within their own stadiums. And if this were a one-off, then I think probably a warning, don't do it again, maybe a small fine. But as Nick says, because this is the third major incident in a row, then I think probably that was the right decision. The country who ends up almost being stiffed by this is Denmark, because they finished 2 points behind Albania, and they finished third. And they do end up qualifying, but they could easily have missed out as a result of Albania being awarded a game which they hadn't actually won. So the awarding of games, I'm also quite uncomfortable with. I think a better solution, if it's at all possible, would be to try and replay the game, if need be, behind closed doors or in a neutral ground, and maybe dock points as a punishment rather than awarding the game. But I can't really fault the decision.
Well, Serbia were given a 3-point deduction, of course, in order to play the next two home games behind closed doors, and both federations were fined €100,000. And of course, they appealed the decision, that was upheld, and then they took their further appeals to the Court of Arbitration for Sport the following July in 2015. Remembering the match was played in October 2014, so it run on a little bit. They rejected the Serbian appeal, but they partly upheld the Albanian one. So the final ruling by CAS was that the match was caused by security lapses of the organisers and acts of violence exerted on the Albanian players by Serbian fans and at least one security steward. And so therefore they reversed the result, awarding Albania a 3-0 victory, which meant that there was a lot riding on that second game, Nick, which you mentioned that you were at, when Serbia actually ran out 2-0 winners.
There was a lot riding on it. And firstly, I would say that, I personally don't think anyone deserved to get the 3 points from that game. And I think, the security lapses from the Serbian end were absolutely inescapable and pretty shocking, actually, to see it in the flesh. But then again, if an Albanian flag hadn't come down and if a load of Albanian players hadn't bundled in on the Serbian player who might have taken the flag away, then none of this happens. So, I know that in terms of technicalities and CAS and the rules, these things don't always level out, but definitely I can't see one clear offender here. But that's how it panned out. And so Albania, in that game, were in this remarkable situation where if they beat Serbia in Elbasan, that they were going to qualify for Euro 2016. So you might have expected a real pressure cooker atmosphere again, and maybe something ramped up further and further from what happened the previous year. So, as I mentioned, a few of us turned up, maybe expecting stuff to happen. I remember my editors at The Guardian were doing minute-by-minutes from home and sort of photo galleries, and I was doing a live report, and, people were expecting quite a lot. And it didn't quite happen. I remember going up into the apartment of someone whose apartment overlooked the stadium in Elbasan the day before, and him saying that he wasn't even going to bother watching the game. They'd all been told not to stand in their apartments. They'd all been told to go somewhere else and totally clear the area around the stadium that night. I remember them being in the stadium and looking up opposite me, and on the building opposite there was a sniper quite clearly stood there, ready to ready to snipe if anything bad happens. So the short story is that the security operation had been absolutely formidable, and you went in, and the atmosphere, to be honest, was almost sterile, given what a big game it was, but probably the biggest in Albania's history now. Given the context, nothing happened. And Albania didn't really show up, and in Serbia, I haven't got the exact goal minutes on me, but they were both right at the end. I think 88 and 90. It counter-attacked twice and won. And everyone went home, and it was just like it was a, given the build up and all the events leading up to it, it was a massive anticlimax. And Albania, of course, 3 or 4 days later, playing Armenia, I think it is, and they absolutely dominate them, and they win 3-0, which was almost unknown for Gianni Dibiase team, and they qualify, and then the celebrations kick off in Tirana and also in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. But that night itself was weird. It just drifted by. Nothing really happened, and you've got the sinister figure the whole time of this at least one sniper up in the building opposite you.
Yeah, I suppose it's enough to sedate any crowd, though, with the threat of that, maybe. But yeah, I take the point. Well, they made it to the Euros, of course, which was their first major tournament. Well, yeah, I think we should end there. But Nick, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this. Thank you very much, and we're very glad you survived quite an incredible ordeal.
Thank you very much for having me.
Not at all. For more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk. That's it for this week. Myself and Jonathan will be back next week with another great game from the history of football. Cheers.